10 seconds. That was all Captain Robert Steele Morgan had. 10 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether 43 American soldiers lived or died. The interior of the M1A1 Abrams tank was a pressure cooker of sweat, tension, and the metallic smell of gun oil. Sand particles danced in the thin beam of light, cutting through the commander's viewport. Through the swirling dust storm outside, the thermal imaging system revealed 5 Iraqi T-72 tanks moving like ghosts across the desert floor, unaware of Morgan's presence. Range to target? Morgan's voice was steady, betraying none of the adrenaline surging through his veins. 1800 meters and closing, sir, replied Sergeant Thomas Walker, the gunner whose steady hands had earned him a reputation as the best shot in the battalion. Morgan's mind raced through his options. Standard procedure dictated waiting for reinforcements. His tank was alone, cut off from the rest of the battalion by the unexpected sandstorm. But the enemy formation was heading directly toward the vulnerable supply convoy behind their position. 9 seconds. Morgan placed his hand on Walker's shoulder, a gesture they'd had shared countless times over their years together. No words were needed. Walker understood. The thermal sights locked onto the lead T-72. 8 seconds. "Sab it up," called Private Sam Cooper from the loader's position as he slammed the 120-millimeter depleted uranium round into the breech. 7 seconds. Morgan made his decision. "Driver forward. Walker, on my command, you take the lead tank. I want 3 rounds in 10 seconds. 6 seconds. The massive Abrams lurched forward, its turbine engine roaring to life as it crested the sand dune that had concealed their position. 5 seconds. All targets, tanks, frontal. Fire and adjust. The cannon roared, sending its deadly projectile streaking across the desert. 4 seconds. The first T-72 erupted in flames as the sabot round penetrated its armor like tissue paper. The turret lifted from its housing in a fountain of fire. 3 seconds. "Target up!" Cooper's voice was mechanical as he loaded the second round with practiced precision. 2 seconds. The second T-72 was turning its turret toward them when Walker's next shot struck at his ammunition carousel. The resulting explosion sent a shockwave across the desert floor. 1 second. The third round found its mark as the remaining Iraqi tanks scattered in confusion. 3 tanks destroyed in 10 seconds. A new record. But this wasn't a training exercise. This was war. And for Captain Robert Morgan, it was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation for this exact moment. 9 months earlier, Fort Irwin, California, National Training Center, July 1990. "You've got to be kidding me," Morgan muttered as he lowered his binoculars. The vast expanse of the Mojave Desert stretched before him, its harsh terrain mimicking the battlefields of the Middle East. Through a cloud of dust, Morgan watched as Alpha Company's tanks maneuvered in perfect formation along the valley floor, directly into the OPFOR's trap. At 45, Captain Robert Morgan was older than most of his peers. The desert sun had etched permanent lines around his eyes that had seen more training exercises than most officers saw in their entire careers. The son of a tank commander who had fought in Korea and the grandson of a man who had driven Shermans across France in World War II, Morgan had tank treads in his blood. "Sir, Alpha's walking right into it," said First Lieutenant Michael Carter, Morgan's young reconnaissance officer. Unlike Morgan, whose salt and pepper hair and weathered face told the story of decades of service, Carter was fresh-faced and eager, a West Point graduate with textbook knowledge but little field experience. "I see it," Morgan replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the unfolding disaster. "And Harrison's not going to do a damn thing about it." Below them, the scenario was playing out exactly as Morgan had predicted during the morning briefing. The opposition force had set up a classic hammer and anvil trap, concealing their main force behind the ridge to the east, while using a small decoy force to draw Alpha Company into the kill zone. Morgan had suggested an alternate approach, a flanking maneuver that would have caught the OPFOR by surprise. But Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, their battalion commander, had dismissed his concerns. "The plan is sound, Captain," Harrison had said, with the dismissive tone he reserved for Morgan. "Not everything needs to be reinvented." Now, as the simulated battle unfolded, Morgan watched Alpha Company's tanks being destroyed one by one, their turrets displaying the bright orange panels that signified a kill in the exercise. "Sir?" Carter's voice pulled Morgan back to the present. "Shouldn't we alert battalion?" Morgan checked his watch. Harrison's already been informed. 3 times. He turned to face his reconnaissance officer. Sometimes, Lieutenant, the hardest part of command isn't knowing what to do. It's watching others make mistakes and being unable to prevent them. The radio crackled to life. Thunderbolt 6, this is Battalion. Opfer has broken through Alpha's position. Adjust your defensive line to grid coordinates Hotel 9 or 3. Over. Morgan exchanged a look with Carter. Those coordinates would place Thunderbolt Company, Morgan's command, directly in the path of the advancing Opfer, with no support on either flank. It was a desperate attempt to plug a gap created by Harrison's poor planning. Battalion, this is Thunderbolt 6. Understood. Moving to Hotel 9 or 3. Morgan set down the radio handset, his mind already calculating. Carter, get back to your platoon. I want your scouts on that ridge line in 15 minutes. Full reports on Opfer strength and composition. Carter nodded and scrambled down the hillside to his waiting Bradley fighting vehicle. Morgan remained for a moment studying the battlefield. The standard response would be to establish a defensive line exactly where Harrison had ordered, absorbing the Opfer's attack and hoping to blunt their advance. It would result in heavy simulated casualties for Thunderbolt Company, but it would follow doctrine. But Robert Morgan had never been one to follow doctrine blindly. 15 minutes later, Morgan was inside his command tank, the massive M1A1 Abrams humming with potential energy like a predator preparing to pounce. Around him, the 14 tanks of Thunderbolt Company were positioned not in the defensive line Harrison had ordered, but in a concealed assault formation along the western ridgeline. All Thunderbolt elements. This is Thunderbolt 6. Morgan's voice was calm but charged with intensity. Confirm ready status. The platoon leaders responded in sequence, each reporting their units ready for Morgan's unorthodox plan. Sir, OPF main body is approaching the valley floor. Carter's voice came through the radio. 30-plus vehicles. Looks like they're expecting to find us at the coordinates battalion specified. Morgan smiled, which means they're not looking for us here. He keyed his radio again. All Thunderbolt elements. We have one shot at this. When I give the command, we execute Plan Avalanche. Confirm understanding. A chorus of affirmatives followed. Morgan looked at his tank crew, Sergeant Walker in the gunner's seat, his eyes focused through the sight. Specialist Martinez at the driver's position, hands resting on the controls. And Private Cooper, the young loader whose mechanical genius had saved the tank from breakdown more times than Morgan could count. Ready to make some history, gentlemen? Walker's response was a soft chuckle. Just another day at the office, sir. Morgan waited until the Opfer column was fully committed to the valley before he gave the order. All Thunderbolt elements. Execute Avalanche, now. 14 Abrams tanks crashed over the ridgeline, engines roaring as they descended upon the exposed flank of the Opfer column. The surprise was complete. In a real battle, it would have been a massacre. Even in the training exercise, the Opfer commanders were caught flat-footed, their vehicles frantically trying to reorient to face the unexpected threat. Within 20 minutes, the simulated battle was over. Thunderbolt Company had destroyed nearly the entire Opfer column while sustaining minimal losses. As Morgan stood on the turret of his tank surveying the aftermath, he spotted a dust cloud approaching from the east, 3 Humvees bearing the battalion staff insignia. Looks like the brass is coming to congratulate us, Martinez said with a grin. Morgan shook his head. I don't think congratulations are on the agenda, Sergeant. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's face was a thundercloud as he strode toward Morgan's tank. Behind him followed Major Peterson, the battalion executive officer, and Captain Reynolds, the operations officer. Captain Morgan, Harrison's voice carried across the desert, explain to me why your company is here instead of at the coordinates you were ordered to defend. Morgan climbed down from his tank, brushing the dust from his uniform. Around him, his tank commanders had emerged from their vehicles, sensing the confrontation brewing. Sir, I assessed that a defensive posture at Hotel 9 or 3 would have resulted in unacceptable casualties. The terrain offered an opportunity for a counterattack that would catch the Opfer in the open. So you deliberately disobeyed a direct order. Morgan stood at attention, his gaze fixed on a point beyond Harrison's shoulder. I adapted to the tactical situation, sir. Harrison's face reddened. You're not paid to adapt, Captain. You are paid to follow orders. With all due respect, sir, we're all paid to win battles. That's what we did today. A murmur of approval ran through the assembled tank commanders, quickly silenced by Harrison's glare. Captain, you've been in long enough to know that chain of command exists for a reason. Your little stunt might have worked in this exercise, but in actual combat, units acting independently can create confusion, friendly fire incidents, and ultimately, defeat. Morgan remained silent, though every fiber of his being wanted to argue. The irony wasn't lost on him. Harrison lecturing about battlefield defeat after his own plan had failed spectacularly. I want your after-action report on my desk by Euro 600 tomorrow, Harrison continued. And Captain, I expect it to include a full accounting of how your company will integrate into battalion operations in the future, without creative interpretations of orders. With that, Harrison turned and walked back to his vehicle, leaving Morgan standing in the desert heat. That went well, said a voice behind him. Morgan turned to find Master Sergeant Jim Bulldog Martinez, his company first sergeant and closest friend in the unit. Martinez was a tank commander from the old school, 50 years old with 30 years of service, his weathered face a map of deployments and training exercises across the globe. He'd been with Morgan for the past 7 years, through peacetime training and Cold War tensions. Could have been worse, Morgan replied. He could have relieved me on the spot. Martinez spat on the ground. He should be pinning a medal on you. We just schooled the Opfer in front of the entire training cadre. Politics, Bulldog. 4 months until Harrison retires. He just wants a smooth transition, no waves. And no innovation, no adaptation, and no victories that don't follow his playbook. Martinez shook his head. Times are changing, sir. The Army's changing. Dinosaurs like Harrison are a dying breed. Morgan looked out across the desert, where his tankers were already beginning maintenance on their vehicles. Maybe, but they're not extinct yet. That evening, as the sun set over Fort Irwin, Morgan sat alone in his temporary quarters, working on the after-action report Harrison had demanded. The small room was Spartan, a cot, a desk, and a small window overlooking the motor pool, where his company's tanks were parked in neat rows. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," Morgan called, expecting it to be Martinez or one of his platoon leaders. Instead, Major David Peterson, the battalion XO, stepped into the room. Unlike Harrison, Peterson was a thoughtful officer who had earned Morgan's respect over the past year. "Got a minute, Morgan?" Morgan stood. "Of course, sir." Peterson waved him back to his seat and closed the door behind him. "Quite a show you put on today." "Just doing my job, sir." Peterson smiled. "That's debatable, according to the colonel." He pulled up the room's only other chair and sat across from Morgan. "Look, I'm not here officially. This is just between us." Morgan set down his pen, giving the major his full attention. "Harrison's going to bury your AAR. He's already spoken with the brigade commander, spinning what happened as a command and control breakdown rather than the tactical masterstroke it was." "I'm not surprised," Morgan replied, "but I don't regret my decision. Nor should you." Peterson leaned forward. "What you did today is exactly the kind of initiative we need. The problem is, Harrison represents an old guard that sees initiative as insubordination." "So I've noticed." Peterson studied Morgan for a moment. "You know, there's talk about deploying elements to the Middle East for joint exercises with the Saudis and Kuwaitis, showing the flag, given the tensions with Iraq." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "And Harrison has made it clear that if any units from this battalion are selected, Thunderbolt Company won't be among them." The news stung, though Morgan was careful not to show it. Being passed over for a deployment, even a training exercise, was a clear message about his standing in the battalion. "I understand, sir." Peterson stood, preparing to leave. "For what it's worth, Captain, there are those of us who recognize what you did today. The Army is changing. Someday soon we'll need officers who can think on their feet, not just follow a playbook." After Peterson left, Morgan returned to his report, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about his father, who had commanded a tank company in Korea, and his grandfather, who had fought across Europe in World War II. Both had told him the same thing. In battle, plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. Adaptability and initiative were often the difference between victory and defeat. Yet here he was, being reprimanded for exactly those qualities. Morgan's contemplation was interrupted by another knock. This time it was Cooper, his young loader, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Sorry to bother you, sir, but there's something wrong with our thermal sight. Maintenance says it'll take 3 days to get a replacement part, but I think I can fix it tonight if you'll authorize the work. Morgan smiled despite his dark mood. Cooper was the kind of soldier who made all the frustration worthwhile. A natural problem solver who never accepted no as an answer when it came to keeping their tank operational. Show me what you've got, Cooper. For the next hour, Morgan watched as Cooper disassembled the complex thermal imaging system using tools he had modified himself. The young private's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, identifying a hairline crack in a circuit board that the maintenance team had missed. See that, sir? Cooper pointed to the barely visible flaw. That's why we're getting those ghost images in the targeting system. I can bypass it with a jump wire until the replacement part arrives. Morgan watched, impressed once again by the young soldier's ingenuity. Where did you learn to do this, Cooper? This isn't standard Army training. Cooper grinned. My grandfather ran an electronics repair shop. I spent every summer there from when I was 8 until I enlisted. He always said that understanding how things work is the first step to making them work better. As Cooper reassembled the system, Morgan reflected on the contrast between Harrison's rigid adherence to procedure and Cooper's innovative approach to problem solving. It was a microcosm of the tension he felt within the Army itself. Tradition versus innovation, procedure versus adaptability. All done, sir, Cooper announced, closing the access panel. Should work fine now. Morgan clapped the young soldier on the shoulder. Good work, Cooper. This is why you're the best loader in the battalion. After Cooper left, Morgan returned to his report with renewed determination. If Harrison wanted a by-the-book assessment, that's exactly what he would get. A technically accurate account that would tick all the procedural boxes while conveying none of the tactical insight or initiative that had actually won the day. Sometimes survival in the modern Army meant knowing when to fight and when to appear to conform. The next morning, Morgan was awakened before dawn by Martinez pounding on his door. Sir, you need to see this. Morgan followed his first sergeant to the company operations center, where a small television was tuned to CNN. A dozen officers and NCOs were gathered around it, watching in silence as the news anchor reported that Iraqi forces had crossed the border into Kuwait in the early hours of the morning. The invasion began approximately 3 hours ago, the anchor was saying. Early reports indicate that Iraqi armor columns have already reached Kuwait City. The Kuwaiti military appears to be offering minimal resistance. Morgan felt a chill run through him. For years, the U.S. Army had trained for a major tank battle against Soviet forces in the Fulda Gap of Germany. Now suddenly, the threat was coming from an unexpected quarter. What's the word from battalion? Morgan asked. Martinez shook his head. Nothing official yet, sir, but I've got buddies at Division HQ. They say the 8th Airborne Corps is already being put on alert. This is going to be big. Morgan watched the footage of Iraqi T-72 tanks rolling through Kuwaiti streets. Those were the same tanks his Abrams were designed to destroy, the same tactics they had trained to counter. After decades of preparing for a war that never came, the possibility of actual combat suddenly loomed large. All right, listen up, Morgan addressed the assembled soldiers. Nothing changes for us yet. We continue training as scheduled, but I want all equipment at 100% readiness. No exceptions. As the men dispersed to their duties, Martinez remained behind with Morgan. You thinking what I'm thinking, sir? Morgan nodded. If this escalates, they're going to need armor. Heavy armor. And we're the best heavy armor unit in the division, Martinez added. Harrison or no Harrison? Throughout the day, news from Kuwait continued to worsen. The small Kuwaiti military had been quickly overwhelmed, and Iraqi forces were consolidating their control over the oil-rich nation. President Bush had made a statement condemning the invasion and calling for an immediate Iraqi withdrawal. Morgan was inspecting his company's tanks when the summons came to report to the battalion headquarters. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense. Harrison stood at the head of the table, flanked by Peterson and other staff officers. The company commanders were seated around the table, all eyes on the large map of the Middle East displayed on the wall. Gentlemen, Harrison began, I've just come from a briefing with the division commander. As you're aware, the situation in Kuwait is deteriorating rapidly. The president has ordered the deployment of elements of the 18th Airborne Corps to Saudi Arabia as a deterrent against further Iraqi aggression. A murmur ran through the room. The Iraqi Airborne Corps was the Army's rapid reaction force, designed to deploy anywhere in the world on short notice. At this time, our battalion is not on the deployment list, Harrison continued. However, the division commander has made it clear that we should begin preparations for possible deployment in the coming weeks. Morgan felt a mix of emotions. The professional soldier in him recognized the opportunity to put years of training to the test in actual combat, but he also understood the gravity of what war would mean, the risk to his men, the separation from family, the possibility that not everyone would return. I expect each of you to review your company's readiness status, Harrison was saying. Personnel issues, equipment maintenance, training deficiencies. I want it all identified and addressed. As of now, all leave is canceled. We train as if deployment is imminent. As the meeting broke up, Morgan found himself face to face with Harrison. Captain, Harrison's voice was cool. I've reviewed your after-action report. Yes, sir. It's adequate. Harrison handed him a folder. Here's your new training schedule. I've assigned Thunderbolt Company to support the battalion's staff exercise for the next 2 weeks. Morgan took the folder, recognizing the assignment for what it was. A sidelining of his company from the main battalion training activities. Support for a staff exercise meant days of sitting idle while officers pushed paper. Is there a problem, Captain? Harrison asked, noting Morgan's expression. No problem, sir. Thunderbolt will be ready to support the staff exercise. Harrison studied him for a moment. See that they are. Dismissed. Outside the headquarters building, Morgan found Martinez waiting by their Humvee. How'd it go? The first sergeant asked. Morgan handed him the folder. We've been assigned to support the staff exercise. Martinez flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. While the rest of the battalion conducts live fire exercises? That's bull, sir. It's Harrison's way of keeping us in our place. Morgan climbed into the passenger seat of the Humvee. But it changes nothing. If this Kuwait situation develops into something bigger, they'll need every tank crew they can get. And when that time comes, I want Thunderbolt to be the best damn tank company in the Army. Later that night, Morgan sat in his quarters on a video call with his wife, Janet. The connection was poor, the image freezing every few seconds, but it was better than nothing. Janet Morgan was a military wife who understood the demands of Army life better than most. A former Army nurse herself, she had met Robert during his first deployment to Germany in the early days of his career. 20 years and countless moves later, she had become his anchor, his confidant, and his most trusted advisor. How are things at home? Morgan asked, trying to keep his tone light despite the weight of the day's events. Janet's pixelated image smiled. The usual. Tommy's summer baseball league is winding down. His team made the playoffs. Their son, Thomas, was following in his father's footsteps. Currently in his second year at West Point, he was home for summer break before returning for the fall semester. And how's he handling the news about Kuwait? Janet's expression grew serious. He's watching it closely. You know Tommy. He called 3 of his classmates today to discuss the tactical implications. Morgan laughed. That sounds like our son. A silence fell between them, the kind that develops between couples who know each other well enough to communicate without words. You think you'll be deployed? Janet said finally. It wasn't a question. Morgan nodded. If this escalates, yes, they'll need armor units, but right now we're not on the list. Because of Harrison? Possibly. Morgan ran a hand through his hair. But if it comes to actual combat operations, those decisions will be made above his pay grade. Janet's image froze momentarily, then resolved. You know, Robert, part of me hopes you do get deployed. Not because I want you in danger, but because I know how much it would mean to you to lead your company in something real after all these years of training. This was why he loved her. She understood him in ways no one else could, his sense of duty, his frustration with the politics of peacetime army, his desire to test himself in the crucible of combat as his father and grandfather had done. I just want to be where I can make a difference, he said simply. Janet nodded. You will be, one way or another. After ending the call, Morgan stepped outside his quarters. The night was clear, the desert stars brilliant overhead. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of the battalion continuing its nightly routine. Vehicles moving, soldiers calling to one another, the persistent hum of a military base that never truly slept. Morgan's thoughts drifted to his father, who had passed away 3 years earlier. Colonel James Morgan had commanded a tank battalion in Korea, earning a Silver Star for valor during a Chinese offensive. He had taught his son that tank warfare was as much art as science, a ballet of steel and fire that required instinct as well as training. "Trust your gut, son," his father had told him once. "When the shells are flying and the radio is squawking and everything's going to hell, you won't have time for textbook solutions. You'll have your training, your crew, and your instinct. The rest is just noise." Now, with the possibility of combat looming, those words resonated more strongly than ever. A week later, the world had changed dramatically. President Bush had drawn a line in the sand, declaring that the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait would not stand. American forces were flowing into Saudi Arabia in Operation Desert Shield, establishing a defensive position to prevent any further Iraqi advance. At Fort Irwin, the pace of training had intensified. The usual schedule of rotations at the National Training Center had been disrupted as units prepared for possible deployment. Morgan's Thunderbolt Company, despite being assigned to support the staff exercise, had found ways to maintain their edge. Martinez had organized unofficial maintenance sessions that doubled as training opportunities. Lieutenant Carter had established a study group focused on Iraqi armored tactics and capabilities. Morgan was conducting an impromptu class on desert navigation when Peterson found him. "Captain, the colonel wants to see you, now." Morgan followed the XO to Harrison's office, wondering what new punishment the battalion commander had devised. Harrison wasn't alone. Seated across from him was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, wearing the stars of a major general. Morgan recognized him immediately: James Maxwell, one of the Army's foremost experts on armored warfare and a legendary figure within the tank community. "Captain Morgan reporting as ordered, sir," Morgan snapped to attention. "At ease, Captain," Harrison said, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. "I believe you know General Maxwell." "By reputation, sir." Morgan turned to the general. "It's an honor, sir." Maxwell stood, offering his hand. "The honor is mine, Captain. I've been hearing interesting things about you." Morgan shot a glance at Harrison, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "General Maxwell is here to discuss the reorganization of armored assets in preparation for possible deployment to Operation Desert Shield," Harrison explained. "The battalion has been placed on alert status." Morgan's pulse quickened. Alert status was the first step toward deployment orders. "The situation is evolving rapidly," Maxwell took over, gesturing for Morgan to sit. "Saddam Hussein has made it clear he has no intention of withdrawing from Kuwait. The president is building an international coalition for what may become a forced eviction of Iraqi forces." "Which means armor," Morgan said. "Heavy armor." Maxwell nodded. "Precisely. The Iraqi Republican Guard has approximately 5 divisions of armor, including T-72 tanks. If it comes to combat, we'll need our best tank units in the fight." The implication hung in the air. If the battalion deployed, would Thunderbolt Company be included, given Harrison's evident distrust of Morgan? As if reading his thoughts, Maxwell continued, "I've been reviewing the training records of various units. Your company's performance has been noteworthy." Harrison cleared his throat. "General, as I mentioned, there have been some command and control issues with Captain Morgan's company." "Yes, you mentioned that," Maxwell replied, his tone dismissive. "I've also reviewed the after-action reports from the NTC cadre. They had a different perspective." He turned back to Morgan. "They described your flanking maneuver as innovative and exactly the kind of tactical thinking needed against Soviet-style armor formations." Morgan remained silent, sensing the power dynamics shifting in the room. Maxwell stood, indicating the meeting was concluding. "Colonel Harrison, I'll need a full readiness report for the battalion by 900 tomorrow. And Captain Morgan, I'd like you to join me for dinner this evening. There are some tactical considerations I'd like to discuss with someone who thinks outside the conventional box." After Maxwell left, Harrison turned to Morgan, his expression unreadable. "It seems you have an admirer, Captain." "Sir, I had no idea the general was—" Harrison held up a hand. "Save it. The situation has changed. The battalion is going to deploy, and Thunderbolt Company will be part of that deployment." He leaned forward. "But let me be clear, Morgan. In a combat zone, chain of command isn't a suggestion. It's the difference between life and death." "I understand that, sir." "I hope you do." Harrison stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Because if we deploy, the stakes won't be orange panels on turrets. They'll be American lives. That evening, Morgan found himself seated across from General Maxwell in the officers' club, discussing armored tactics over stakes. The club was nearly empty, most officers occupied with preparation for possible deployment. "Your reputation precedes you, Morgan," Maxwell said after they had exchanged pleasantries. "Both good and bad." "I'm aware of that, sir." Maxwell cut a piece of his steak. "Harrison thinks you're a loose cannon, a risk to good order and discipline." Morgan chose his words carefully. "Colonel Harrison and I have different perspectives on the balance between following orders and adapting to battlefield conditions." A smile played at the corners of Maxwell's mouth. Diplomatically put. He set down his knife and fork. "Let me be direct, Captain. The Army is changing. The Cold War is effectively over. The threat we've trained for since the 1950s, massive Soviet armored columns pouring through the Fulda Gap, is rapidly becoming obsolete. And now we're facing a different kind of armored threat," Morgan added. "Iraqi forces with Soviet equipment, but different tactics and leadership." "Exactly." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "The officers who will succeed in this new environment aren't the ones who can recite doctrine verbatim. They're the ones who can adapt doctrine to new circumstances." Morgan felt a surge of vindication at the general's words, but kept his expression neutral. "May I ask, sir, why you've taken an interest in my company?" Maxwell studied him for a moment. "Because, Captain Morgan, I believe we're on the cusp of the first major tank battle since World War II. And when that happens, I want officers in command who understand that war is chaos, and chaos requires adaptation, not rigid adherence to a playbook." The general took a sip of his water. "There's going to be a change in your battalion leadership." Morgan stiffened. "Sir?" "Harrison has submitted his retirement paperwork, effective immediately. He claims it's for family reasons, but between us, I think he recognizes that combat command isn't his strong suit." This was unexpected news. Harrison was just months from retirement anyway, but his early departure would create a leadership vacuum at a critical time. "Who will take command?" Morgan asked. "Lieutenant Colonel Richard Bennett. He's being transferred from the War College. Brilliant tactical mind, wrote the book on modern armored warfare. Literally, he'll arrive tomorrow to begin the transition." Morgan knew Bennett by reputation. His textbook on armored tactics was required reading at the Armor Officer Advanced course. "One more thing, Morgan," Maxwell said, his tone becoming serious. "Bennett will be looking for a company commander to serve as his battalion executive officer when we deploy. Based on your experience and unconventional thinking, I've recommended you for the position." The offer took Morgan by surprise. Battalion XO was a prestigious position, typically a stepping stone to a battalion command of one's own, but it would also mean giving up direct command of Thunderbolt Company. "I'm honored by the recommendation, sir," Morgan replied carefully. "But if we deploy into combat, I'd prefer to remain with my company. We've trained together for 2 years. They're ready." Maxwell smiled. "I thought you might say that. It speaks well of you, Captain." He signaled for the check. "Bennett will make his own decisions, of course, but I suspect he'll value a company commander who puts his men above personal advancement." The next morning, the battalion was assembled on the parade ground to welcome their new commander. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Eagle Bennett was younger than Harrison by a decade, tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. His address to the battalion was brief and to the point. "Gentlemen, I'm not one for long speeches. We're going to war. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. Every minute between now and then is a minute we should be preparing. Training, honing our edge. The Iraqi army has Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine. We've spent 40 years preparing to defeat that combination. Now we'll have our chance." Bennett paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled soldiers. "I've reviewed the records of this battalion. You're good, but good isn't enough. By the time we deploy, you will be excellent. You will be the standard against which other armored units measure themselves. That is my promise to you and my expectation of you." After dismissing the battalion, Bennett called the company commanders to the headquarters building. Morgan found himself studying the new battalion commander, trying to gauge the man who would lead them into combat. Bennett wasted no time. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed your training records. your equipment status, and your personnel files. You're behind where you need to be. That changes today. He turned to a large map of the Middle East pinned to the wall. The Iraqi army has dug into defensive positions along the Kuwait-Saudi border. They're expecting us to come straight at them, a frontal assault into prepared defenses. That would be costly and ineffective. Bennett traced a line on the map, swinging wide to the west of the Iraqi positions. Instead, we'll likely be part of a massive flanking maneuver, coming at them from the desert where they're not expecting us. That means long-range desert navigation, extended operations without resupply, and the ability to engage and destroy enemy armor at maximum range. He turned back to face the company commanders. Starting tomorrow, we begin an accelerated training program focused on these skills. Captain Reynolds, your Alpha Company will focus on long-range gunnery. Captain Lewis, Bravo Company will work on desert navigation and maintenance under extreme conditions. Bennett's gaze fell on Morgan. Captain Morgan, I understand your Thunderbolt Company has shown particular aptitude for innovative tactical maneuvers. Morgan wasn't sure if this was a compliment or a criticism. We try to adapt to battlefield conditions, sir. Bennett's expression remained unreadable. Good. Your company will focus on night operations and rapid exploitation of breakthrough opportunities. I want scenarios that push the envelope of what our tanks and crews can do. After assigning training objectives to the remaining companies, Bennett dismissed the group. As Morgan turned to leave, Bennett called out, Captain Morgan, a word. When they were alone, Bennett studied Morgan for a long moment. I've read your file, impressive record, distinguished service in Germany during the Cold War, top of your class at the Armor Officer Advanced course, multiple commendations for tactical excellence in training exercises. Thank you, sir. I've also read about your disagreements with Colonel Harrison. Morgan stiffened. Sir, Bennett held up a hand. Relax, Captain. I'm not Harrison. A slight smile crossed his face. In fact, I reviewed the specific incident that caused so much friction. Your flanking maneuver against the OPFOR was exactly the kind of tactical thinking we'll need against the Iraqis. Relief washed over Morgan. I appreciate that, sir. Bennett moved to the map, studying it thoughtfully. The coming fight will be unlike anything the Army has experienced since World War II. It won't be won by officers who can recite doctrine. It will be won by those who can adapt doctrine to the realities of the battlefield. He turned back to Morgan. I need company commanders who think, who adapt, who seize opportunities when they present themselves. Based on your record, you're that kind of officer. I try to be, sir. Bennett nodded. Good, because I'm going to push you and your company harder than the others. I need to know what you're capable of when the pressure is highest. As Morgan left the headquarters building, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he was being valued for the very qualities that Harrison had seen as liabilities. Outside, he found Martinez waiting by their Humvee. How'd it go with the new boss? The first sergeant asked. Morgan allowed himself a small smile. Better than expected. Much better. Martinez grinned. So we're back in the game? We never left, Bulldog. Morgan climbed into the Humvee, but now someone's finally noticed. That night, as Morgan prepared for bed, the small television in his quarters showed footage of American tanks being unloaded at Saudi Arabian ports. The buildup was accelerating. The clock was ticking toward what might become the largest tank battle since the great armored clashes of World War II. Morgan thought about his crew, his company, and the challenge ahead. After years of training for a war that never came, they were now preparing for a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. The prospect was both sobering and, if he was honest with himself, exhilarating. His father's words echoed in his mind. Trust your gut, son. In the coming months, that gut instinct would be tested as never before. The desert sands awaited, and with them, the ultimate test of everything Morgan had spent his career preparing for. The clock was ticking toward his 10 seconds of truth. The desert wind carried the scent of diesel fuel and hot metal as Captain Robert Morgan walked the line of Thunderbolt Company's tanks. 2 months had passed since Lieutenant Colonel Bennett had taken command of the battalion, and in that time, everything had changed. The pace of training had intensified to a fever pitch. Equipment had been upgraded, tactics refined, and the men pushed to the limits of their endurance. Morgan paused beside the tank commanded by Lieutenant Eric Donovan, The young platoon leader's face streaked with grease as he helped his crew replace a trackpad. "How's it coming, Lieutenant?" Morgan asked, his voice carrying over the persistent hum of the portable generators powering the maintenance area. Donovan straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Almost done, sir. Another 20 minutes and she'll be ready for tonight's exercise." Morgan nodded approvingly. Under Bennett's new training regime, officers were expected to work alongside their crews, getting their hands dirty and understanding their vehicles from the inside out. It was a far cry from Harrison's approach, where officers had been encouraged to maintain a certain distance from the enlisted men. "Good work," Morgan said. "Bennett wants full readiness reports by 1600. Make sure you're squared away." As Morgan continued his inspection, he reflected on the transformation that had occurred since Bennett's arrival. The new battalion commander had been true to his word, pushing every company to its limits. But Thunderbolt Company had received special attention, tasked with the most challenging scenarios, the most ambitious objectives. At first, Morgan had wondered if Bennett was testing him, looking for weaknesses to exploit. But as the weeks passed, he'd come to realize that the extra pressure was a form of respect. Bennett was pushing Thunderbolt Company because he believed they could handle it. The radio on Morgan's hip crackled to life. "Thunderbolt 6, this is Battalion. Colonel Bennett requests your presence at the TOC, ASAP." Morgan acknowledged the call and headed toward the Tactical Operations Center, a cluster of camouflage-netted tents at the center of their training area. Inside, the air-conditioned space was a hive of activity, with staff officers poring over maps and communications personnel monitoring radio traffic. Bennett was standing at the main table, studying a large topographical map of what appeared to be the Kuwait-Iraq border region. He looked up as Morgan entered. "Captain Morgan, good. We've received updated intelligence on Iraqi defensive positions." Bennett gestured to the map, where red markers indicated enemy concentrations. "The Republican Guard has reinforced their positions along the expected avenues of approach. They're digging in, preparing for a war of attrition." Morgan studied the map, noting the density of red markers along the main highways and known terrain corridors. "They're expecting us to follow the path of least resistance." Bennett nodded. Standard Soviet doctrine. Defend the likely approaches, channel the enemy into killing zones. He traced a finger across an empty section of the map, a vast expanse of desert west of the main Iraqi positions. "But what if we don't play by their rules? What if we come at them from the desert where they're not expecting us?" Morgan immediately grasped the concept. A wide flanking maneuver, hundreds of kilometers through the desert. Exactly. It would require extended operations without established supply lines, navigating across featureless terrain, and maintaining combat effectiveness at the end of a grueling journey. Bennett's eyes locked with Morgan's. "In other words, everything we've been training for." Bennett motioned for Morgan to follow him to a more private corner of the TOC. "The deployment orders have come through, Morgan. The battalion ships out in 3 weeks." Despite having anticipated this moment for months, Morgan felt a surge of adrenaline at the news. After years of training for a war that never came, they were now heading into actual combat. "The men will be ready, sir," Morgan said with quiet confidence. Bennett's expression remained serious. "I know they will, but there's something else we need to discuss." He handed Morgan a folder. "These are the latest intelligence reports on the Republican Guard divisions we're likely to face. Their T-72s may be a generation behind our Abrams, but they're still lethal, especially in the hands of experienced crews. And some of their commanders were trained in the United States. They know our doctrine, our tactics." Morgan opened the folder, scanning the reports. "So they'll be anticipating our standard playbook, which is why we need to throw out the playbook." Bennett lowered his voice. "The battalion staff is working on a conventional battle plan, as they should. But I'm authorizing you to develop an alternative approach for Thunderbolt Company, something unorthodox that could be implemented if the conventional approach fails." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Sir, that's not standard procedure." Bennett's mouth curved in a slight smile. "No, it's not. But neither is driving hundreds of tanks across a desert to outflank a dug-in enemy. This whole operation is going to require us to rewrite the book on armored warfare." As Morgan left the TOC, his mind was already working on the challenge Bennett had presented. An alternative approach, something the Iraqis wouldn't expect from an American armored unit. The possibilities were intriguing, But first, he had another, more personal matter to attend to. That evening, Morgan sat in his quarters, staring at the telephone. It was time to call Janet and share the news of their imminent deployment. These calls never got easier, despite the decades of practice. He dialed, listening to the long-distance connection establish itself with a series of clicks and static bursts. "Hello?" Janet's voice came through, slightly distorted but unmistakable. "Hi, honey," Morgan said, trying to keep his tone light. "How's everything at home?" There was a pause, and Morgan knew his wife had detected something in his voice. After 20 years of marriage, they could read each other's tones like books. "The orders came through, didn't they?" Janet asked quietly. Morgan sighed. "Yes, 3 weeks." The silence that followed spoke volumes. Both of them had known this was coming, had been preparing for it mentally and emotionally, but the reality was always different from the anticipation. "Tommy's going to want to come home from school to see you before you leave," Janet finally said. Their son, a cadet at West Point, had been following the Kuwait crisis with the intensity of someone who knew his father would likely be involved. "No," Morgan replied firmly. "He needs to stay at the academy. His education can't be interrupted every time the Army deploys me somewhere." Janet's soft laugh carried through the line. "You know he's going to argue with you about that." "Let him argue. The answer's still no." They talked for another hour, discussing practical matters, bills that would need to be paid, maintenance the house would need, the support network of other military spouses that Janet would rely on during his absence. They didn't discuss the danger. They never did. It was an unspoken agreement between them, a way of maintaining sanity in a life filled with separation and risk. As the call was ending, Janet's voice took on a more serious tone. "Robert, promise me something. Anything. Don't try to be a hero, just do your job and come home." Morgan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. "I promise." After hanging up, Morgan sat in silence for several minutes. Janet's last request echoed in his mind. Don't try to be a hero. The irony wasn't lost on him. His job, leading tanks into battle against a dug-in enemy, was exactly the sort of thing that civilians would consider heroic. But Janet understood, as all military spouses did, that true heroism in combat wasn't about glory or medals. It was about bringing your people home alive. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Cooper, the young loader from his tank crew. "Sorry to bother you, sir," Cooper said, his expression troubled. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" Morgan nodded, gesturing for the young soldier to enter. "What's on your mind, Cooper?" Cooper hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, I just got a call from home. My mom's sick. Cancer. They say it's pretty advanced." Morgan felt a pang of sympathy. Cooper was barely 22, with the kind of natural mechanical aptitude that made him invaluable as a tank crew member. Despite his youth, he'd become one of the most respected soldiers in the company due to his quiet competence and unwavering reliability. "I'm sorry to hear that, Cooper. Is there anything I can do to help?" Cooper looked down at his hands. "That's just it, sir. My dad asked if there is any way I could get compassionate leave, just for a couple of weeks, to see her before—" His voice trailed off. Morgan understood the unspoken request. With deployment imminent, compassionate leave would mean Cooper would miss the initial movement overseas. By the time he rejoined the unit, they might already be in combat. Standard procedure would be to deny the request. Every soldier was essential, especially experienced tank crew members like Cooper. The mission came first. That was the Army way. But as Morgan looked at the young soldier, he saw not just a loader, but a son worried about his mother. A human being facing one of life's most difficult moments. "Put in the paperwork, Cooper," Morgan said quietly. "I'll approve it and send it up the chain with my recommendation." Relief washed over Cooper's face. "Thank you, sir. I won't be gone long, I promise." After Cooper left, Morgan stared at the wall, thinking about the decision he'd just made. Bennett might overrule him. The Battalion S1 might find a regulation to block the leave. But Morgan would fight for it, because sometimes being a good officer meant remembering that your soldiers were human beings first, with lives and loves and losses beyond the Army. The next morning, as Morgan was preparing for the day's training exercise, Martinez appeared at his door. "You've got a visitor, sir," the first sergeant said, his expression unusually somber. "A Miss Emily Cooper, Private Cooper's sister." Morgan felt a chill run through him. Cooper had only mentioned his mother being ill the night before. Had something happened so quickly? The woman waiting outside was in her late 20s, her resemblance to Cooper unmistakable in the shape of her eyes and the set of her jaw. Her expression was a mixture of grief and determination. "Captain Morgan?" she asked as he approached. "I'm Emily Cooper, Sam's sister." Morgan nodded. "Ms. Cooper. Is everything all right with your mother?" Emily's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Sam told you about Mom? That's unusual for him. He doesn't like to burden others with our family problems. He mentioned she was ill. He was requesting compassionate leave to visit her." Emily's expression clouded. "Mom's been sick for over 2 years, Captain. The doctors gave her 6 months back then, but she's been fighting hard." She hesitated. "That's not why I'm here." Morgan felt a sense of unease. "Then why are you here, Ms. Cooper?" "Because I know my brother. When he called last night, he didn't sound right. He talked about Mom, yes, but he also said some things that worried me." Emily met Morgan's gaze directly. "Sam's always been the strong one in our family, Captain, the reliable one, but everyone has a breaking point." Morgan considered her words. "Are you suggesting Private Cooper is having some kind of psychological issue?" Emily shook her head. "Not exactly. But with the deployment coming up, and Mom's condition, and the stress of all the training, I'm worried he might do something rash." "Like what?" "I don't know exactly, but he mentioned feeling like he was being torn in half between his duty to his unit and his duty to his family." Emily's voice trembled slightly. "I just don't want him making a decision he'll regret for the rest of his life." Morgan understood her concern. In the pressure cooker environment of pre-deployment training, soldiers sometimes made impulsive decisions, going AWOL, self-inflicting injuries, anything to avoid deployment. It was rare among professional soldiers like Cooper, but not unheard of. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Cooper," Morgan said. "I'll talk to your brother today." After Emily left, Morgan sought out Martinez and explained the situation. "I know Cooper better than anyone in this company," Martinez said firmly. "He's solid. No way he'd go AWOL or pull some stunt to avoid deployment." "I agree," Morgan replied, "but his sister's concern seems genuine. We need to find out what's really going on." Finding Cooper proved challenging. The company was scattered across the training area, preparing vehicles and equipment for the night's exercise. It wasn't until late afternoon that Morgan located him, working alone on the thermal site of Morgan's own tank. "Cooper," Morgan called, climbing up beside the young soldier. "Got a minute?" Cooper straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yes, sir. Just finishing the calibration on your site. Should be good to go for tonight's exercise." Morgan studied the young soldier's face, looking for signs of distress or unusual behavior. Cooper appeared tired. They all were, but otherwise normal. "Your sister came to see me today," Morgan said, deciding on the direct approach. Cooper's expression registered surprise, then annoyance. "Emily, what did she want?" "She's worried about you. Said you sounded strange on the phone last night." Cooper sighed, setting down his tools. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Always. Emily worries too much. Always has. Ever since our dad left when we were kids, she's appointed herself the family protector." Cooper shook his head. "I called home last night, yes. Mom's condition is stable. Not good, but stable. Emily must have misinterpreted something I said." "So there's nothing wrong?" Morgan pressed. "Nothing bothering you beyond the normal pre-deployment stress?" Cooper hesitated, just long enough for Morgan to know there was more to the story. "Cooper," Morgan said quietly, "whatever it is, I need to know. Not just as your commanding officer, but as someone who's responsible for your welfare." Cooper's shoulders slumped slightly. "It's not about going AWOL or anything like that, sir. I would never abandon the unit. It's about—" He trailed off, struggling to find the words. "About what?" Morgan prompted. "About being afraid," Cooper finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not of dying. I've made my peace with that risk. But of failing. Of freezing up when it matters most. Of being the weak link that gets someone else killed." The admission hung in the air between them. In the hyper-masculine culture of the Army, and especially in combat units, admitting fear was tantamount to admitting weakness. It wasn't something soldiers discussed openly, especially with their commanding officers. Morgan considered his response carefully. The standard officer approach would be to offer reassurance, remind Cooper of his training, and move on. But Morgan sensed that what the young soldier needed was something more authentic. "Let me tell you something, Cooper," Morgan said, sitting down on the turret beside him. "My father commanded a tank company in Korea. Night before their first major engagement, he couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about all the ways he might fail his men. Morning came and they moved out. First North Korean tank they encountered, my father froze. Just for a second, but it felt like an eternity to him." Cooper was listening intently now, his eyes fixed on Morgan's face. His gunner, guy named Martinez actually, no relation to our first sergeant, took the shot without waiting for the order. Knocked out the enemy tank. After the battle, my father pulled Martinez aside, thanked him for picking up the slack. Know what Martinez said? Cooper shook his head. He said, "Sir, I froze too. My body just pulled the trigger anyway because we'd trained so much." Morgan smiled at the memory. "That's the thing about training, Cooper. We do it until the right responses become automatic, like breathing. When the moment comes, your body will know what to do, even if your mind is paralyzed with fear." Cooper absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "Your father told you that story?" "Many times. It was his way of teaching me that courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Cooper nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. I guess I needed to hear that." Morgan clapped him on the shoulder. "We all do, from time to time. Even old war horses like me." As Morgan climbed down from the tank, he felt a renewed appreciation for the burden carried by his men, especially the younger ones facing combat for the first time. It was easy to forget, amid the technical challenges and logistical preparations, that the human element remained the most complex and vital part of any military operation. That night's training exercise was the most ambitious yet, a complex night movement followed by a coordinated attack on multiple objectives. Bennett had designed the scenario to test the battalion's ability to operate in darkness, navigate across difficult terrain, and maintain unit cohesion under challenging conditions. Morgan's Thunderbolt Company had been assigned the most difficult objective, a simulated Republican Guard command post defended by the OFFR's best tank crews. They would have to breach a minefield, cross a wadi in darkness, and attack from an unexpected direction. As the exercise began, Morgan stood in the commander's hatch of his Abrams, night vision goggles transforming the desert darkness into an eerie green landscape. Around him, the 14 tanks of Thunderbolt Company moved in formation, their massive forms surprisingly graceful as they navigated the terrain. Morgan's tank crew worked with the synchronized precision of long practice. Walker, the gunner, continuously scanned for targets through the thermal sight. Martinez, temporarily serving as driver due to a personnel shortage, guided the 60-ton vehicle smoothly across the desert floor. And Cooper, seemingly reinvigorated after their conversation, handled the loading duties with his usual quiet efficiency. The attack went perfectly, too perfectly, in Morgan's estimation. The OPFOR, playing the role of Iraqi defenders, had been overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of Thunderbolt's assault. In a real battle, enemy forces rarely cooperated so obligingly. As the exercise concluded and the after-action review began, Bennett echoed Morgan's concerns. "Too clean," the battalion commander said, addressing the assembled company commanders. "The enemy won't just sit there and take it. They'll adapt, improvise, throw wrenches into our perfect plans. We need to increase the difficulty, add more variables." For the next 2 weeks, Bennett did exactly that. Each exercise became more challenging than the last. The OPFOR was given more freedom to improvise, to spring surprises. Weather conditions were factored in, simulated sandstorms, extreme heat, equipment failures. Through it all, Thunderbolt Company continued to excel, adapting to each new challenge with growing confidence. Morgan watched with pride as his men evolved from a collection of individuals into a cohesive fighting unit, capable of overcoming whatever obstacles were placed in their path. Then came the news they had all been anticipating. Operation Desert Shield was transitioning to Operation Desert Storm. The diplomatic efforts to persuade Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait had failed. The coalition forces would now remove them by force. The deployment timetable accelerated. Instead of 3 weeks, they had 7 days to complete their preparations and begin movement to the port of embarkation. The pace became frenetic. Equipment was inspected, repaired, and loaded for transport. Personal affairs were put in order. Wills were updated. Letters were written to loved ones, just in case. Morgan found himself working 18-hour days, overseeing every aspect of Thunderbolt Company's preparations. He was in the motor pool, reviewing maintenance records, when Bennett found him. "Morgan, I need to speak with you privately," the battalion commander said, his expression unusually grave. They walked to a quiet area behind the maintenance bay. "I've just come from division headquarters," Bennett began without preamble. "There's been a change to the deployment plan. The battalion will still ship out as scheduled, but Thunderbolt Company is being held back." Morgan felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. "Sir, Division has decided they need a company-sized element to remain behind for security and training duties. The selection was made at division level based on some algorithm involving deployment history and personnel factors." Morgan struggled to process this information. After months of intensive preparation, after forging his company into a finely tuned fighting unit, they were to be left behind? It was incomprehensible. "Sir, with all due respect, Thunderbolt Company is the most prepared unit in the battalion. We've consistently outperformed the other companies in every training metric." Bennett nodded. "I know that, Morgan. I made the same argument to the division commander, but the decision has been made." Morgan felt a surge of anger, quickly suppressed by years of military discipline. "What am I supposed to tell my men?" "The truth, that sometimes the Army makes decisions that don't make sense from our perspective, that their training and preparation have not been in vain." Bennett placed a hand on Morgan's shoulder. "And that I'm going to continue fighting this decision until the last possible moment." As Bennett walked away, Morgan remained rooted in place, trying to come to terms with this unexpected turn of events. How could he face his men? How could he tell them that while their comrades were heading into battle, they would be left behind to guard an empty post and train replacements? Martinez found him still standing there 10 minutes later. "Sir, everything okay?" Morgan turned to his first sergeant, his expression bleak. "No, Bulldog, everything is not okay." He explained the situation. Martinez's reaction mirrored his own. Disbelief, followed by anger, followed by the stoic acceptance that was the hallmark of career soldiers. "The men aren't going to take this well," Martinez said finally. "No, they're not, but they're professionals. They'll do their duty, whatever it is." That evening, Morgan gathered Thunderbolt Company in the company area. Standing before them, looking at the faces of men he had led and trained for 2 years, he found it difficult to begin. "I have news," he said finally, "and it's not good news." As he explained the division's decision, he watched the emotions play across his soldiers' faces. Shock, disbelief, anger, disappointment. These men had prepared themselves mentally and emotionally for combat. They had made peace with the risks, steeled themselves for the challenge. To have that purpose taken away at the last moment was a psychological blow that no training had prepared them for. When he finished speaking, there was silence. Then, from the back of the formation, a voice called out, "This is bullshit, sir." It was Walker, the normally reserved gunner from Morgan's own tank crew. "You're right, Walker, it is," Morgan replied, deciding that honesty was more important than decorum in this moment. "But it's the hand we've been dealt, and we'll play it like professionals." The next few days were the most challenging of Morgan's career. Maintaining morale in the face of such disappointment required all his leadership skills. Some soldiers became sullen, others angry. A few requested transfers to other units that were still deploying, though such requests were automatically denied given the time frame. Through it all, Morgan maintained a stoic front, channeling his own disappointment into constructive action. He organized additional training exercises, kept the men busy with maintenance and preparation tasks, and spent hours listening to their frustrations. 4 days before the battalion's scheduled departure, Morgan was summoned to Bennett's office. The battalion commander was on the phone when Morgan arrived, his expression animated as he argued with someone on the other end. "No, sir, I understand the algorithm. What I don't understand is why we're slave to it when it clearly doesn't account for combat readiness." Bennett paused, listening to the response. "Yes, sir, I appreciate your consideration." He hung up, turning to Morgan with a hint of a smile. That was the Division G3. I've been making calls all week, trying to get this decision reversed. No luck so far, but I'm not giving up. Morgan nodded, appreciating Bennett's efforts even as he resigned himself to the likely outcome. In the meantime, Bennett continued, I need to discuss the arrangement for Thunderbolt Company once the battalion deploys. You'll be under the administrative control of the rear detachment commander, but for operational matters, you'll report directly to the post commander. They spent an hour reviewing the details of Thunderbolt's responsibilities after the battalion's departure. Morgan took notes mechanically, his mind still struggling to accept the reality of being left behind. As the meeting concluded, Bennett fixed Morgan with an intense gaze. Don't give up hope yet, Captain. This isn't over. That night, unable to sleep, Morgan walked through the company area. The tanks were lined up in neat rows, their massive forms silhouetted against the desert sky. Each had been meticulously prepared for deployment, weapon systems checked and rechecked, engines tuned, communications equipment calibrated. Morgan stopped beside his own tank, placing a hand on the cold steel of the turret. This machine, and the men who operated it, represented the culmination of his military career. They were ready to test themselves in the crucible of combat, ready to put years of training to the ultimate test, and now they would remain behind, their potential unrealized. A sound behind him made Morgan turn. It was Cooper, the young loader, also unable to sleep. Evening, sir, Cooper said quietly. Just checking on something in the ammo compartment. Morgan nodded, not questioning the implausible excuse for being out after hours. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Cooper shook his head. No, sir. Keep thinking about what's coming. Or what was coming, I guess I should say. They stood in silence for a moment, two soldiers contemplating the vagaries of military life. You know what's ironic, sir? Cooper said finally. All those nights I lay awake worried about going into combat, afraid I might freeze up or fail somehow. Now all I can think about is how much I want the chance to prove I wouldn't. Morgan understood completely. That's the paradox of our profession, Cooper. We train for war while hoping it never comes. But when it does come, we want to be part of it. Not because we love war, but because we've dedicated ourselves to being ready for it. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. Do you think there's still a chance the decision could be reversed, sir? There's always a chance, Morgan replied, not wanting to extinguish the young soldier's hope, even as his own faded. But we need to prepare ourselves for the reality that we might be staying behind. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as the battalion continued its preparations for deployment. The first elements were already moving out, transport vehicles laden with equipment heading for the port of embarkation. Morgan was in his office, completing paperwork for the turnover of Thunderbolt Company to the rear detachment, when his phone rang. Captain Morgan, this is Colonel Bennett. I need you in my office immediately. The tone in Bennett's voice sparked a glimmer of hope in Morgan's chest. He hurried across the battalion area, passing groups of soldiers engaged in last-minute preparations. Bennett was not alone in his office. With him was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, wearing the stars of a major general. Morgan recognized him immediately, General Maxwell, the same officer who had introduced Bennett to the battalion months earlier. Captain Morgan, Maxwell greeted him with a firm handshake. Good to see you again. Colonel Bennett has been singing your praises. Thank you, sir, Morgan replied, still trying to gauge the purpose of this meeting. Bennett wasted no time. I've been making calls all week, Morgan, all the way up the chain. Finally got through to someone who could do something about our situation. He nodded toward Maxwell. The general picked up the thread. The decision to hold back Thunderbolt Company was made based on a personnel management algorithm that didn't account for unit readiness or specialized training. Once Colonel Bennett brought the discrepancy to my attention, I was able to intervene. Morgan felt his pulse quicken. Sir? Maxwell smiled. The orders have been changed, Captain. Thunderbolt Company will deploy with the battalion as originally planned. Relief and elation washed over Morgan in equal measure. Thank you, sir. My men will be grateful for the opportunity. Don't thank me yet, Maxwell cautioned. Your company is now going to be at the spearhead of the battalion's advance. You'll be the first to make contact with Iraqi forces, the first to test their defenses. It's a position of honor, but also of extreme risk. Morgan nodded, understanding the implications. Thunderbolt will be ready, sir. After Maxwell departed, Bennett provided more details. The deployment timeline is accelerated now. Your company moves out tomorrow, 24 hours ahead of the rest of the battalion. That gives you less than a day to get your men and equipment ready. Morgan's mind was already racing through the logistical challenges. We'll be ready, sir. Bennett studied him for a moment. I know you will. That's why I fought so hard to get this decision reversed. When Morgan returned to the company area and announced the news, the transformation in his men was immediate and profound. The sullenness and frustration of recent days vanished, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and determination. All right, listen up, Morgan called out, standing atop an ammunition crate to address the assembled company. We've got 24 hours to prepare for movement. I want every tank inspected from top to bottom, every weapon system checked and rechecked, every piece of communication equipment tested and verified. The men dispersed with a new energy, tackling their assigned tasks with an enthusiasm that had been absent in recent days. Morgan moved among them, offering guidance, answering questions, and providing the calm, steady leadership they would need in the days ahead. As night fell, the pace of preparation continued unabated. Portable lights were set up around the company area, creating pools of harsh illumination in which soldiers worked on their vehicles with focused intensity. Morgan found Cooper beneath his tank, making a final adjustment to the track tension. How's it coming, Cooper? Morgan asked, crouching down to see the young soldier's work. Cooper emerged, his face streaked with grease but his eyes bright with purpose. Almost done, sir. Just making sure she's ready for whatever we encounter over there. Morgan nodded approvingly. Good man. As he stood to move on, Cooper called after him. Sir, I just wanted to say thank you for whatever you did to get us back on the deployment list. I didn't do anything special, Cooper. Just made sure the right people knew what Thunderbolt Company is capable of. By dawn, the company was ready. 14 Abrams tanks and their support vehicles were lined up in the motor pool, engines idling, crews standing by for the order to move out. Morgan walked the line one last time, exchanging words with each tank commander, making sure every detail had been addressed. These final moments before deployment were critical, the last chance to catch any oversights, to address any concerns. At the end of the line, he found Martinez waiting beside the Humvee that would lead the convoy to the port. All set, Bulldog? Morgan asked. Martinez nodded. Ready as we'll ever be, sir. Morgan glanced back at the assembled vehicles, at the men who would soon be following him into harm's way. You know, a part of me thought this day would never come. After all the training, all the preparation, I half expected something to happen at the last minute to keep us from deploying. Like the division trying to leave us behind. Martinez grinned. Exactly like that. Morgan returned the smile. But here we are. Here we are, Martinez echoed, about to find out if all that training was worth it. The convoy began moving at 0700 right on schedule. As they passed through the main gate of Fort Irwin, Morgan looked back at the place that had been their home and training ground for so long. The next time they saw this landscape, they would be different men, shaped by whatever experiences awaited them in the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait. The journey to the port was uneventful, a stark contrast to the high-tension movement they would soon be undertaking in a combat zone. At the port, organized chaos reigned as military units from across the United States converged, their equipment being loaded onto massive transport ships bound for Saudi Arabia. Thunderbolt Company's tanks were driven onto the deck of a roll-on, roll-off vessel, secured for the long sea journey. The men would follow on military transport aircraft, meeting their equipment when it arrived in Saudi Arabia. As the last tank was secured, Morgan gathered his men for a final address before they separated for the journey. Gentlemen, the next time you see these tanks, we'll be in Saudi Arabia, preparing for combat operations against Iraqi forces. Everything we've trained for, everything we've prepared for, is about to become reality. He looked at the faces before him, some young and eager, others older and more measured, all united by their commitment to duty and to each other. I won't lie to you. The days ahead will test us in ways we cannot fully anticipate. But I have absolute confidence in each of you. You are the finest tank crews in the United States Army, and you will prove it on the battlefield. Morgan paused, considering his next words carefully. There's an old saying that no plan survives contact with the enemy. That's true, but what also survives is the training, the discipline, and the bond between soldiers who trust each other with their lives. Those are the things that will carry us through whatever challenges lie ahead. As the men dispersed to prepare for their own transportation, Morgan found himself alone on the deck of the ship, looking at the tanks that would soon be carrying them into battle. Each was a marvel of technology and engineering: composite armor capable of withstanding direct hits, a 120mm cannon that could destroy enemy tanks at ranges beyond 3 kilometers, thermal imaging systems that turn night into day. But the true strength of Thunderbolt Company wasn't in the machines. It was in the men who operated them, men like Walker, whose steady hands on the gun controls could mean the difference between life and death. Men like Cooper, whose technical skills kept those machines running at peak performance. Men like Martinez, whose decades of experience provided stability and perspective in the chaos of combat. Morgan's thoughts were interrupted by the ship's horn, signaling the imminent departure. It was time to go, to begin the journey that would take them to the threshold of war. 3 days later, Morgan stood on the tarmac of a military airfield in Saudi Arabia, watching as C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft disgorged streams of soldiers into the desert heat. The temperature was well over 100 degrees, the sun a merciless presence in a cloudless sky. Bennett appeared beside him, having arrived on an earlier flight. "Your men are all accounted for?" Morgan nodded. "Yes, sir. Last group is deplaning now. No issues reported." "Good. We've got a situation developing that you need to be aware of." Bennett led Morgan to a quieter area of the tarmac. "Intelligence reports indicate that Iraqi forces are making adjustments to their defensive positions. They've identified the most likely avenues of approach for our armored units and are reinforcing those areas with additional tanks and anti-tank weapons." Morgan absorbed this information. "They're preparing for a frontal assault." "Exactly, which means our flanking strategy is still viable, but there's a complication." Bennett unfolded a map pointing to a section of the Kuwait-Iraq border. "Satellite imagery has detected what appears to be a new minefield here, along one of our planned approach routes. If confirmed, we'll need to adjust our movement plan." Morgan studied the map. "When will confirmation come?" "That's where Thunderbolt Company comes in." Bennett's expression was grave. "Division wants a reconnaissance in force to verify the minefield and assess Iraqi defensive positions in this sector. Your company has been selected for the mission." Morgan understood what Bennett was not saying explicitly. Thunderbolt would be moving ahead of the main force, potentially making first contact with Iraqi defenses. It was a position of honor, but also of significant danger. "When do we move out?" Morgan asked. 48 hours. Your tanks are being offloaded now. You'll have tomorrow for maintenance and preparation. Then you'll begin movement the following morning." As Bennett walked away, Morgan remained studying the map, tracing the route Thunderbolt Company would take into potential enemy contact. After months of training and preparation, the reality of combat was now just days away. The next day was a blur of activity as Thunderbolt's tanks were checked, refueled, and prepared for combat operations. The desert heat made every task more difficult, with metal surfaces becoming too hot to touch in the direct sun. Despite the challenging conditions, the men worked with focused determination, understanding the importance of having their equipment in perfect working order. Morgan was overseeing the loading of ammunition when he was approached by a captain from the Division Intelligence Section. "Captain Morgan, I'm Captain Reynolds, G2 Shop. I've been sent to brief you on some updated intelligence regarding your upcoming mission." Morgan led Reynolds to the company command post, a cluster of tents providing minimal shelter from the sun. Reynolds spread a series of satellite photos across a field table. "These were taken yesterday. They show increased Iraqi activity in your area of operations. We've identified what appear to be elements of the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard moving into defensive positions here and here." He pointed to dark specks on the photos that Morgan recognized as tank formations. "The Tawakalna Division?" Morgan's interest sharpened. The Tawakalna was one of Iraq's elite Republican Guard divisions, equipped with the best tanks and most experienced crews in the Iraqi military. "Yes, and here's where it gets interesting." Reynolds indicated another photo. "One of the battalion commanders in that division is Major Khalid al-Rashidi. He attended the U.S. Army Armor Officer Advanced Course at Fort Knox 5 years ago, graduated near the top of his class." Morgan absorbed this information with growing concern. An Iraqi commander trained in American tactics would have a deep understanding of how U.S. armored units operated. He would anticipate standard maneuvers, know the strengths and weaknesses of American equipment. So we'll be going up against someone who knows exactly how we're trained to fight, Morgan summarized. Reynolds nodded. Exactly. Which is why your recon mission is so critical. We need to know how he's setting up his defense, what he's anticipating from our approach. After Reynolds departed, Morgan called his platoon leaders together to share the updated intelligence. The knowledge that they would potentially be facing an enemy commander trained in American tactics added a new dimension to their mission. This changes our approach, Morgan told them. If al-Rashidi is expecting standard American tactics, then we need to give him something unexpected. Lieutenant Donovan, his most experienced platoon leader, nodded thoughtfully. So we throw out the playbook? Not entirely, but we adapt it, use our strengths in ways he won't anticipate. The discussion continued into the night, with Morgan and his officers developing a modified approach that would leverage their technological advantages while avoiding predictable patterns that an Iraqi commander familiar with American doctrine might expect. As the meeting concluded, Morgan pulled Cooper aside. How are the thermal sights on all tanks? 100% operational, sir. We did a full calibration check today. Good. I have a feeling we're going to be relying heavily on them. That night, as Morgan tried to sleep in the stifling heat of his tent, his mind kept returning to the challenge ahead. Thunderbolt Company would soon be moving into enemy territory, potentially making first contact with a force commanded by someone who understood American armored tactics. The standard approaches would be anticipated, the usual counter moves prepared for. Success would require innovation, adaptability, and the courage to deviate from doctrine when the situation demanded it. Exactly the qualities Bennett had been emphasizing in their training. As sleep finally claimed him, Morgan's last conscious thought was a memory of his father's words. Trust your gut, son. When the shells are flying and the radio is squawking and everything's going to hell, you won't have time for textbook solutions. The moment of truth was approaching. Soon those words would be put to the ultimate test. Dawn broke over the Saudi Arabian desert in a palette of gold and amber. Captain Robert Morgan stood beside his tank, watching as the first rays of sunlight glinted off the barrels of Thunderbolt Company's 14 Abrams tanks. The vehicles were arranged in a herringbone formation, a defensive posture that allowed each tank to cover the others while minimizing their vulnerability to enemy fire. It was time. After months of preparation, countless training exercises, and the long journey from California to Saudi Arabia, they were about to cross the line of departure and enter enemy territory. Intelligence had confirmed the presence of Iraqi forces ahead, including elements of the elite Republican Guard Tawakalna division. Morgan climbed atop his tank, gathering his crew and the platoon leaders for a final briefing before movement. Gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying across the still morning air. In 30 minutes, we cross into Iraq. Our mission is reconnaissance in force, identify enemy positions, confirm the reported minefield, and assess defensive preparations. But let's be clear about what that really means. We're the tip of the spear. First contact with the enemy will be ours. He paused, looking at each face in turn. These were no longer the untested soldiers who had begun training under Harrison's cautious command. They were confident, prepared, forged by Bennett's demanding regime into a cohesive fighting unit. The enemy we face is well-equipped and well-led. Major al-Rashidi knows our doctrine, our tactics. He's expecting us to follow the playbook. So we're going to give him something unexpected. Morgan turned to a map spread across the turret of his tank. First and second platoons will advance along the planned route, making plenty of noise, drawing attention. Meanwhile, third platoon will conduct a wide flanking movement to this ridge overlooking the suspected minefield. Lieutenant Donovan, commanding third platoon, studied the map. That's rough terrain, sir, lots of wadis and soft sand. Which is exactly why al-Rashidi will not expect us to come that way, Morgan replied. The Abrams can handle it. Your platoon will provide overwatch while the rest of the company conducts its reconnaissance. If enemy contact is made, you'll be in position to engage from their flank. Morgan checked his watch. We move in 25 minutes. Any questions? There were none. The plan had been thoroughly discussed the previous evening. Each man knew his role, understood the mission parameters. All right then, return to your vehicles. Radio check at 055U. And the officers dispersed. Morgan found himself momentarily alone with Cooper, his young loader. Ready for this, Cooper? Morgan asked quietly. Cooper nodded, his expression a mixture of determination and nervous energy. Ready as I'll ever be, sir. Just want to get it started, you know? The waiting's the hardest part. Morgan understood completely. Combat veterans often spoke of the terrible anticipation before battle, the churning stomach, the racing thoughts, the hyper-awareness of one's own mortality. Once the action started, training took over. Fear receded to the background. But the waiting was psychological torture. Just remember your training, Morgan said. Trust it. Trust your crew. At 0545, Thunderbolt Company began its advance. The massive engines of the Abrams tanks roared to life, filling the desert with their distinctive turbine whine. Sand and dust billowed as the vehicles moved forward, crossing the invisible line that separated Saudi Arabia from Iraq. Morgan stood in the commander's hatch of his tank, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. The terrain ahead was relatively flat, with occasional wadis, dry riverbeds, cutting across the landscape. Perfect tank country, except for the constant threat of hidden minefields. For the first hour, they encountered nothing but empty desert. The heat built steadily as the sun climbed higher, turning the tank's interior into an oven, despite the environmental control system's best efforts. Morgan and his crew rotated between positions in the hatch, taking turns in the relative coolness of the interior and the exposed but better ventilated commander's position. Thunderbolt 6, this is 3-6, Donovan's voice came over the radio. We've reached checkpoint Alpha, beginning flanking movement now. Morgan acknowledged, watching as 3rd Platoon's 4 tanks peeled away from the main formation, angling northwest toward the ridgeline that would give them a commanding view of the area ahead. The company continued its advance, maintaining strict radio discipline. Though they were still well outside the range of Iraqi artillery, the threat of radio direction finding, using their transmissions to locate their position, was taken seriously. 2 hours into the mission, they reached the coordinates where intelligence had reported the suspected minefield. Morgan ordered a halt, bringing the company into a defensive position while he conferred with the battalion's attached combat engineer officer, Lieutenant Phillips. What are we looking for? Morgan asked as they surveyed the terrain through binoculars. Phillips scanned the ground ahead. Fresh excavation, regular patterns in the sand. Sometimes they don't even try to hide them. They want us to see them, to channel our movement into their kill zones. After several minutes of observation, Phillips pointed to a section of desert about a kilometer ahead. There, see that discoloration? Slightly darker sand in a linear pattern. Morgan focused his binoculars on the indicated area. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the subtle variations in the desert landscape, he detected it, a barely perceptible line of darker sand stretching across their planned route. Minefield? Morgan asked. Phillips nodded. Almost certainly, and a hastily laid one at that. They wanted it in place quickly, which means it might not be as thoroughly covered as their doctrine calls for. Morgan considered this information. The minefield's presence confirmed the intelligence report, but its hasty nature suggested that the Iraqi defenses might not be as fully prepared as feared. Can your team clear a path through it? Morgan asked. Phillips shook his head. Not quickly, and not without making a lot of noise. Better to find a way around if possible. Morgan reached for his radio handset. 3-6, this is Thunderbolt 6. Confirm your position. Thunderbolt 6, 3-6. We're in position on the ridge. I have eyes on what looks like a minefield to your front, extending for approximately 2 kilometers east to west. Any sign of enemy observation posts or defensive positions beyond the minefield? There was a pause as Donovan scanned the terrain. Negative on observation posts, but I'm seeing what might be prepared fighting positions about 3 kilometers beyond the minefield. No vehicles visible yet. Morgan digested this information. The presence of prepared positions but no visible vehicles suggested that the Iraqi forces were holding back, perhaps waiting until an American advance was confirmed before moving their tanks forward to the fighting positions. Understood, 3-6. Maintain your position and continue observation. Report any movement. Morgan turned to Phillips. We need to find the edge of this minefield, see if there's a way around. For the next hour, Thunderbolt Company carefully probed the edges of the minefield, maintaining a safe distance while searching for its boundaries. The task was complicated by the heat, which was now well over 100 degrees, and by the need to minimize their profile to avoid detection by Iraqi observation. Thunderbolt 6, this is 3-6. Donovan's voice crackled over the radio, tension evident in his tone. I've got movement, multiple vehicles moving toward the fighting positions from the northeast. Morgan felt his pulse quicken. Identify vehicle type and numbers. I count 15 vehicles, T-72 tanks, and what looks like BMPs. They're moving into the prepared positions now. Iraqi armored forces were taking up defensive positions beyond the minefield. The game was afoot. 3-6, maintain observation. Do not engage unless engaged first. Morgan considered his options. Their mission was reconnaissance, not engagement. They had confirmed the minefield and now had eyes on enemy armor moving into defensive positions. The prudent course would be to withdraw and report this intelligence to battalion. But something didn't feel right. The Iraqi deployment seemed too convenient, too visible. If al-Rashidi was as clever as his reputation suggested, he wouldn't be moving his forces in broad daylight where they could be easily observed. Cooper, Morgan called down into the tank, hand me the thermal sight. Cooper passed up the portable thermal imaging device, a recent addition to their equipment. Unlike standard optics, which relied on visible light, thermal imaging detected heat signatures, allowing observation of objects that might be concealed from normal view. Morgan swept the device across the landscape beyond the minefield. The regular Iraqi tanks and BMPs were clearly visible as bright spots against the cooler background of the desert. But then, as he expanded his search area, he noticed something else, a cluster of heat signatures off to the west, partially concealed in a wadi that ran perpendicular to their position. I'll be damned, Morgan muttered. Donovan, check your 3 o'clock position. There's a wadi about 4 kilometers from your position. Use your thermal. A moment passed. Then, confirmed, sir. I've got multiple heat signatures in the wadi. Looks like I count at least 10 more tanks, possibly T-72s, hull down in the wadi. Morgan smiled grimly. Al-Rashidi was indeed clever. The visible deployment was a decoy, meant to draw attention while his main force remained concealed, waiting to spring the trap once American forces committed to an assault on the obvious positions. All Thunderbolt elements, this is Thunderbolt 6. We've identified enemy armor in prepared positions beyond the minefield, plus a concealed force in a wadi to the west. We've accomplished our reconnaissance objective. Prepare for withdrawal to phase line Bravo. As Thunderbolt Company began its measured withdrawal, Morgan radioed Bennett with their findings. The battalion commander listened intently, then responded with a question that took Morgan by surprise. What's your assessment of the situation, Morgan? Beyond the raw intelligence. What's your gut telling you? Morgan considered the question. Bennett was asking for more than just a report. He wanted Morgan's intuitive read of the enemy's intentions. Sir, I think al-Rashidi is setting up a classic defense in depth. The minefield channels are advanced. The visible tanks draw our fire and attention, while the concealed force waits to strike our flank once we're committed. It's textbook Soviet doctrine with a twist, using our own reconnaissance against us, showing us what he wants us to see. Bennett was silent for a moment. Then, that matches our broader intelligence picture. But there's a new development. Division has detected a large Iraqi force moving south from Kuwait City, possibly reinforcements for the border defenses. They want to strike before those reinforcements arrive. Morgan felt a chill despite the desert heat. What does that mean for us, sir? It means your reconnaissance mission just became something more. Division is authorizing a limited offensive operation to disrupt the Iraqi defenses before they can be reinforced. Thunderbolt Company will lead the assault. When the orders that followed were clear but daunting, Thunderbolt Company, supported by elements of the battalion's artillery, would conduct a feint toward the visible Iraqi positions, drawing attention and fire. Meanwhile, a larger force from the battalion would execute a flanking movement to strike the concealed Iraqi tanks in the wadi. If successful, the operation would disrupt the Iraqi defensive preparations and delay the integration of the incoming reinforcements. Morgan gathered his platoon leaders to explain the new mission. Their expressions reflected the gravity of the situation. They were no longer conducting reconnaissance, but preparing for direct combat against a well-equipped and well-positioned enemy. Questions? Morgan asked after outlining the plan. Lieutenant Carter, his youngest and most aggressive platoon leader, spoke up. Sir, if we're the decoy, we're going to take the brunt of their fire. How much damage are we expected to absorb? It was a fair question. The feint would only work if it was convincing, which meant exposing themselves to enemy fire long enough to draw a response. We'll be at the extreme edge of their effective range, Morgan replied. Our job is to make noise, be visible, and get them to commit their reserves. But we're not martyrs. If the fire becomes too intense, we withdraw to the fallback position here. He indicated a depression on the map that would provide some cover. As the officers dispersed to brief their tank commanders, Martinez approached Morgan. Sir, permission to speak freely? Morgan nodded, recognizing the serious expression on his first sergeant's face. This feels rushed. Division detecting a movement, and suddenly we're launching an offensive? Something doesn't add up. Morgan had been having the same thought. The rapid escalation from reconnaissance to assault seemed uncharacteristic of the methodical planning that had defined their preparation for the conflict. I know, Bulldog, but these are our orders. All we can do is execute them as safely and effectively as possible. Martinez nodded, accepting the reality of their situation. The men will be ready, sir. They've been waiting for this moment. The assault was scheduled to begin at 1600 hours, when the angle of the sun would be in the eyes of the Iraqi defenders, making it more difficult for them to spot the American flanking force. As the hour approached, Morgan gathered his crew for a final check. Walker, his gunner, was methodically running through the fire control system checks. Cooper was organizing the ammunition, ensuring that the right rounds were in position for rapid loading. And Martinez, who had insisted on taking the driver's position for this mission, was making final adjustments to the tank's mechanical systems. Listen up, Morgan said, drawing their attention. What we're about to do is dangerous. We're deliberately drawing enemy fire to allow the battalion to strike from another direction. I need each of you at your absolute best. Cooper looked up from his ammunition preparations. Sir, permission to load sabot rounds instead of heat for the initial engagement? If we're at the edge of their range, we'll need the extra velocity. Morgan smiled at the young loader's tactical thinking. Good call, Cooper. Load sabot. At precisely 1600 hours, Thunderbolt Company began its advance toward the Iraqi positions. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor and creating a golden glare that would hamper Iraqi gunners looking west. All Thunderbolt elements maintain spacing. Advance at 15 kilometers per hour. Remember, we want to be seen. The company moved in a staggered formation, maximizing their visible profile while maintaining enough dispersion to avoid presenting a concentrated target. They advanced to within 4 kilometers of the minefield, close enough to be clearly visible to Iraqi observers, but still beyond the effective range of the T-72's 125mm gun. Movement in the Iraqi positions, Donovan reported from his observation point on the ridge. They're reacting to our presence. Tanks are adjusting positions, gun tubes traversing. Morgan watched through his binoculars, seeing the distant Iraqi tanks shifting, preparing for the American advance. So far, the feint was working. The question was whether al-Rashidi would commit his concealed force in the Wadi before the battalion's flanking movement could strike. 3-6, any movement from the Wadi? Morgan asked. Negative, Thunderbolt 6. The concealed force remains in position. Morgan ordered the company to halt just beyond 4 kilometers from the Iraqi positions. Now began the most dangerous part of the operation, maintaining a visible presence without becoming easy targets. All tanks conduct simulated fire control operations, traverse turrets, elevate and depress gun tubes, make them think we're preparing to engage. For 15 minutes, Thunderbolt Company maintained its position, tanks moving in a choreographed display of pre-attack preparations. The Iraqi forces continued to adjust their own positions in response, but held their fire, likely waiting for the Americans to move within optimal range. Then, without warning, the desert erupted in a series of massive explosions. The battalion's artillery had opened fire on the visible Iraqi positions, the shells arcing high overhead before plunging down among the T-72s and BMPs. That's our cue, Orca, Morgan radioed. All Thunderbolt elements, advance to phase line Charlie. Maintain maximum dispersion. The tanks of Thunderbolt Company surged forward, closing the distance to just over 3 kilometers from the Iraqi positions. As they advanced, the first incoming rounds began to land around them, Iraqi artillery responding to the American bombardment. "Incoming," Walker called from the gunner's position. "They're bracketing our position." Morgan felt the concussion of a nearby impact, sand and debris pattering against the tank's armor. The Iraqis were finding their range quickly, suggesting experienced artillery observers were directing their fire. "Thunderbolt 6, this is 3-6. Donovan's voice was urgent. "The Wadi force is moving. I repeat, the concealed tanks are moving out of their positions." Al-Rashidi had taken the bait, committing his reserve force earlier than expected. It was a testament to Thunderbolt Company's convincing performance as the main attack force. "All Thunderbolt elements, be advised. Enemy armor is emerging from concealed positions to our west. Maintain focus on your assigned sectors." Morgan switched to the battalion command frequency. "Thunder 6, this is Thunderbolt 6. The Wadi force is on the move. I say again, enemy reserve is moving from concealed positions." Bennett's response was immediate. "Understood, Thunderbolt 6. Eagle element is moving into position for the flanking attack. Continue your demonstration for 3 more minutes, then initiate withdrawal to phase line Bravo." Those 3 minutes were the longest of Morgan's life. Iraqi artillery fire intensified, the rounds landing with increasing accuracy around Thunderbolt's positions. Then the first tank rounds began to arrive. 125mm shells from the T-72s falling short of their targets, but serving as a deadly reminder of what awaited if they closed the distance further. 2-3 is hit," came a call over the company net. "Mobility kill, track damaged, crew is okay." Morgan quickly assessed the situation. One of 2nd Platoon's tanks had taken damage to its track assembly, immobilizing it but leaving the crew and weapon systems intact. 2-6, dispatch your recovery vehicle to assist 2-3. All other elements maintain positions. The specialized M88 recovery vehicle attached to 2nd Platoon moved forward, risking enemy fire to reach the damaged tank. Within minutes, they had attached tow cables and began pulling the disabled Abrams back towards safety. Finally, the 3 minutes elapsed. "All Thunderbolt elements, begin withdrawal to phase line Bravo. Maintain covering fire for 2-3 and the recovery vehicle." As Thunderbolt Company began its fighting withdrawal, Morgan heard the distinctive sound of Apache attack helicopters passing overhead, moving to engage the Iraqi forces emerging from the Wadi. The battalion's flanking attack was underway. "Contact!" Walker shouted from the gunner's position. "T-72, 2 o'clock, 3,000 meters." Morgan dropped down into the tank, taking his position behind Walker. Through the thermal sight, he could see the Iraqi tank, its heat signature a bright blob against the cooling desert landscape. "Identified," Morgan confirmed. "Sabat, tank." "Up," Cooper called, indicating the round was loaded. "Fire." The Abrams shuddered as its 120mm gun fired, the depleted uranium penetrator streaking across 3 kilometers of desert to strike the Iraqi tank. Through the sight, Morgan watched as the T-72 erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent its turret spinning into the air. "Target destroyed," Walker reported calmly. "New target, BMP, same vicinity." The engagement continued as Thunderbolt Company withdrew, trading shots with the Iraqi forces at extreme range. The superior fire control systems of the Abrams, combined with the skill of their gunners, gave them a decisive advantage. For every shot the Iraqis fired, most of which fell short or went wide, the American tanks scored hits with deadly accuracy. By the time Thunderbolt reached phase line Bravo, the battalion's flanking attack was in full swing. Apache helicopters and the tanks of Bravo Company had struck the Iraqi reserve force as it emerged from the Wadi, catching it in the open without prepared fighting positions. "Thunderbolt 6, this is Thunder 6, Bennett's voice came over the radio. "Flanking attack is succeeding beyond expectations. The enemy reserve is in disarray. Well done on your part of the operation." Morgan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The plan had worked. Thunderbolt Company had successfully drawn out the Iraqi reserve, making it vulnerable to the battalion's main attack. They had suffered only 1 damaged tank, with no personnel casualties. But the battle was far from over. As darkness fell, Morgan received new orders from Bennett. The successful disruption of the Iraqi defenses had created an opportunity that division wanted to exploit. Thunderbolt Company was to conduct a night movement around the eastern edge of the minefield, where reconnaissance had identified a gap and establish a blocking position behind the Iraqi defensive line. From there, they could interdict any reinforcements attempting to reach the frontline Iraqi units. "We move in 1 hour," Morgan informed his platoon leaders. "Night vision devices checked and operational. Strict light discipline. This will be a silent approach. No radio transmissions unless absolutely necessary." As the men prepared for the night operation, Morgan found Cooper making adjustments to the thermal imaging system on their tank. "How are we looking, Cooper?" Morgan asked. Cooper nodded confidently. "Good to go, sir. I've tweaked the contrast settings for better definition at distance. We should be able to identify vehicle types at up to 2,000 meters, even in total darkness." Morgan patted the young loader on the shoulder. "Good work. We're going to need every advantage tonight." The night movement began at 2200 hours. Thunderbolt Company, minus the damaged tank which remained at the rally point with a security detachment, moved in single-file formation. Each driver used night vision goggles to follow the faint thermal signature of the tank ahead, maintaining precise distances in the darkness. The route took them east of the known minefield, then north through a series of shallow wadis that provided some concealment from Iraqi observation posts. The going was slow, the tanks advancing at little more than walking pace to minimize noise and dust. After 3 hours of painstaking movement, they reached the designated blocking position, a slight ridge overlooking a highway that intelligence had identified as the likely approach route for Iraqi reinforcements. "All Thunderbolt elements, establish defensive positions along phase line Delta," Morgan ordered over the radio, keeping his voice low despite the electronic transmission. "Hull down where possible. Minimum crew and vehicles. Maintain observation sectors." The tanks maneuvered into position, using the ridge for cover, while maintaining clear fields of fire over the highway and surrounding desert. With the vehicles in position, Morgan ordered minimum crew manning, 1 man awake in each tank while the others rested, rotating every 2 hours to maintain alertness. Morgan took the first watch in his own tank, standing in the commander's hatch with night vision goggles, scanning the darkness. The desert at night was eerily beautiful. The landscape transformed into a monochrome world of greens and blacks through the goggles. Stars crowded the sky overhead, providing just enough natural illumination for the sensitive devices to function effectively. 2 hours into their vigil, Morgan detected movement on the highway, a column of vehicles moving south, their headlights blazing in the darkness, creating blooms of light in his night vision. "Contact, highway, multiple vehicles," Morgan reported quietly over the company net. "All elements, man your stations. Prepare for possible engagement." The sleeping crew members quickly returned to their positions, systems powering up silently as they prepared for combat. Through his thermal sight, Morgan identified the lead vehicles as trucks, supply vehicles, or troop transports rather than armored fighting vehicles. Behind them came a mixed column of tanks and BMPs moving rapidly down the highway toward the frontline positions. "I count 20-plus vehicles," Walker reported from the gunner's position. "Lead elements are trucks, followed by T-72s and BMPs, range 3,000 meters and closing." Morgan switched to the battalion frequency. "Thunder 6, this is Thunderbolt 6. We have eyes on enemy reinforcements moving south on Highway 8. 20-plus vehicles including armor. Request instructions." Bennett's response was immediate. "Thunderbolt 6, you are cleared to engage. Priority targets are the armored vehicles. Prevent those reinforcements from reaching the frontline positions." Morgan took a deep breath. This would be their first deliberate engagement, not a meeting engagement or a defensive response, but a planned attack from an ambush position. "All Thunderbolt elements, prepare to engage. Tanks first, then support vehicles. On my command." He waited until the Iraqi column had entered the optimal kill zone, the section of highway most exposed to their position, with no easy exits or cover nearby. "Fire!" 14 120mm guns roared in the darkness, their muzzle flashes momentarily turning night to day. The lead Iraqi tanks erupted in flames as depleted uranium penetrators punched through their armor with devastating effect. The Iraqi column dissolved into chaos. Vehicles swerved off the road, others collided in their panic to escape the unexpected attack. Some of the tanks managed to traverse their turrets toward the American positions, firing blindly into the darkness. Shift fire to secondary targets, Morgan ordered, as the initial targets burned. Maintain fire discipline. Confirmed kills only. For 10 minutes, Thunderbolt Company methodically destroyed the Iraqi column. The superior night-fighting capabilities of the Abrams, combined with their elevated position and the complete surprise they had achieved, made it a one-sided engagement. Iraqi return fire was sporadic and ineffective, their older tanks lacking the sophisticated thermal imaging systems that allowed the Americans to see clearly in darkness. When the firing finally ceased, the highway was a graveyard of burning vehicles. Those Iraqi forces that had survived had abandoned the road, scattering into the desert in an attempt to escape the deadly American tanks. Cease fire, Morgan ordered. All elements report status. Each platoon reported in. No casualties, no damage. The ambush had been a complete success. Thunder 6, this is Thunderbolt 6, Morgan reported to Bennett. Enemy reinforcement column destroyed. We count 15+ armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. Remaining enemy forces have dispersed. Excellent work, Thunderbolt 6, Bennett responded. Maintain your blocking position. Be advised, division reports large-scale Iraqi withdrawals along the front. Your action appears to have accelerated their retreat. As dawn broke over the desert, Morgan surveyed the aftermath of the night's engagement. The highway below was littered with the smoking hulks of Iraqi vehicles, some still burning, despite the hours that had passed since their destruction. It was a sobering sight, the first real evidence of Thunderbolt Company's lethal effectiveness in actual combat. Martinez joined him at the edge of the ridge. Hell of a night, sir. Morgan nodded, his expression somber. Yes, it was. Martinez studied his commander's face. Something bothering you, sir? We just won a major engagement without a single casualty. That's about as good as it gets in this business. I know, Bulldog. It's just... Morgan gestured toward the destroyed column. Look at those vehicles. Some of them are supply trucks, fuel tankers. How many of those drivers were just doing their jobs, not even combatants in any real sense? Martinez considered this. Can't think about it that way, sir. They're supporting the Iraqi military machine. That makes them legitimate targets. Logically, I know that, but seeing it in daylight... Morgan trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. Doesn't matter. We did our job. Those reinforcements would have extended the fight, cost more lives on both sides. Their conversation was interrupted by a radio call from battalion. New orders were coming in. The successful disruption of the Iraqi defenses had created an opportunity for a major breakthrough. The entire battalion would now advance along Highway 8 toward Kuwait City, exploiting the gap created by Thunderbolt's ambush. Looks like we're on the move again, Morgan told Martinez. Tell the men to top off fuel and ammunition. We roll in 30 minutes. The advance that followed became one of the most rapid armored movements in military history. With Iraqi defenses crumbling and reinforcements disrupted, American armored units pushed forward at unprecedented speed. Thunderbolt Company, having proven its effectiveness in the initial engagements, was given the honor of leading the battalion's advance. They encountered sporadic resistance, isolated Iraqi units that had not received withdrawal orders or that chose to stand and fight rather than retreat. Each was dealt with swiftly and decisively, the overwhelming firepower and superior tactics of the American forces proving insurmountable. By late afternoon, they had advanced nearly 60 kilometers, far beyond their original objectives. As they prepared to establish defensive positions for the night, Morgan received an urgent radio call from Bennett. Thunderbolt 6, we have a situation developing. Division Intelligence has identified a Republican Guard armored brigade attempting to establish a blocking position 10 kilometers east of your location. They're setting up in a defensive posture across our planned route of advance. Morgan studied his map. Understood, sir. What are our orders? Division wants that blocking position eliminated before dawn. They're sending air support, but weather might limit its effectiveness. I'm authorizing you to conduct a limited probing attack tonight, identify their dispositions. We'll follow with the main force at first light. Roger that, sir. We'll move out within the hour. As Morgan briefed his platoon leaders on the new mission, he could sense their fatigue. The men had been in continuous operations for nearly 24 hours, advancing, fighting, advancing again. But they were professionals, and the mission came first. This will be a reconnaissance in force, Morgan explained, pointing to the map. We approach to within visual range, identify their positions, then withdraw. No major engagement unless they initiate contact. Questions? Lieutenant Donovan raised his hand. Sir, what if this is another trap, like al-Rashidi set for us at the minefield? It was a valid concern. The Iraqi commander had already demonstrated his cleverness once. That's why we're approaching with extreme caution, Morgan replied. We'll use the terrain for cover, advance with minimum profile. If anything feels wrong, we pull back immediately. As darkness fell, Thunderbolt Company moved out, advancing cautiously toward the reported Iraqi positions. The terrain was more broken here, with rolling hills and deeper wadis providing both cover for their approach and potential hiding places for Iraqi forces. They had advanced to within 5 kilometers of the reported Iraqi positions when Cooper, scanning ahead with the thermal sight, detected something unusual. Sir, I'm picking up heat signatures ahead, but they don't match vehicle profiles. They're too small, too numerous. Morgan took the sight, studying the thermal images. Cooper was right. Instead of the distinct signatures of tanks or APCs, he was seeing dozens of smaller heat sources scattered across the landscape. Infantry, Morgan realized. They've dismounted infantry in forward positions. This was unexpected. Iraqi doctrine, following the Soviet model, rarely employed infantry without armored support, especially not as forward screening elements. All Thunderbolt elements halt and maintain current positions, Morgan ordered. We have identified dismounted infantry ahead, possible ambush or screening force. As they observed, the pattern became clearer. The infantry positions were arranged in a semicircle, creating what appeared to be a kill zone. Behind them, barely visible at the extreme range of their thermal sights, were what might be tank positions. It's a trap, Morgan concluded. They're trying to draw us into that semicircle where their tanks can engage us from 3 sides. What's the play, sir? Martinez asked from the driver's position. Morgan considered their options. Their mission was reconnaissance, not engagement. They had identified the Iraqi positions, confirming the presence of the blocking force. The prudent action would be to withdraw and report. But something about the setup bothered him. The trap was too obvious, too easily detected with their thermal imaging systems. Al-Rashidi was too clever for such a basic deception. Cooper, give me the long-range thermal again, Morgan requested. Using the device, he conducted a wider scan of the area, looking beyond the obvious infantry positions and suspected tank locations. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, as he was about to return the sight to Cooper, he noticed a faint heat signature in a wadi nearly 3 kilometers to the east of the main Iraqi position. There, Morgan said, directing Cooper's attention to the signature. What does that look like to you? Cooper studied it through the sight. It's hot, but dispersed, not a vehicle, maybe multiple smaller heat sources clustered together. Infantry in a tight formation. Morgan had another suspicion. Or a command post, vehicle engines running for power generation, multiple bodies in a confined space. If he was right, they might have located al-Rashidi's command post, the nerve center coordinating the Iraqi defense. Taking it out would significantly degrade their ability to mount an effective resistance to the battalion's advance. Morgan switched to the battalion frequency. Thunder 6, this is Thunderbolt 6. We've identified enemy positions, including what appears to be a command and control element separated from the main force. Request permission to conduct limited strike on this high-value target. There was a pause as Bennett considered the request. Can you hit it without engaging their main force? Affirmative, sir. We can approach from the southeast, using the wadis for cover. They appear to be focused on their western approaches, expecting us to come directly at their main position. Proceed with the operation, Thunderbolt 6, but withdraw at the first sign that they have detected your approach. We can't afford to lose your company to a trap. Morgan outlined his plan to the platoon leaders. First and second platoons would remain in their current positions, providing overwatch and a base of fire if needed. Third platoon, under Donovan, would accompany Morgan's command tank on the flanking movement to strike the suspected command post. The approach took nearly 2 hours, the tanks moving at a crawl through the network of wadis to avoid detection. Eventually, they reached a position just 800 meters from the target, close enough for a high-probability kill, yet still beyond the effective range of most anti-tank weapons the infantry might possess. Through his thermal sight, Morgan could now clearly identify the command post. 3 vehicles were arranged in a triangle with a camouflage net stretched between them, creating a covered work area. Figures moved between the vehicles, officers and communications specialists coordinating the defense. All 3rd Platoon tanks target the command vehicles. My tank will target the central vehicle, on my command. Morgan settled behind his gunner, confirming the target through the thermal sight. Heat round, he ordered, choosing the high-explosive anti-tank round for its greater destructive effect against soft targets. Up, Cooper confirmed as the round was loaded. Fire! The Abrams shuddered as its main gun fired, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the desert night. Through the sight, Morgan watched as the heat round struck the central vehicle, detonating with a blinding flash. Almost simultaneously, the other tanks of 3rd Platoon fired, their rounds striking the remaining vehicles with devastating effect. The command post erupted in flames, secondary explosions indicating the presence of ammunition or fuel. Figures scattered from the inferno, some engulfed in flames, others running blindly into the desert. Target destroyed, Walker reported. No movement from the, contact. Vehicles moving from the main Iraqi position. The Iraqi force had detected their attack and was responding. Tanks were moving from their prepared positions, heading toward the burning command post. All 3rd Platoon elements, withdraw along Route Echo. Return to base position with all speed. As they pulled back, Morgan could see Iraqi tanks pursuing, trying to close the distance. But the superior speed of the Abrams, combined with the darkness and broken terrain, allowed them to break contact and return to the main company position. Once reunited with the rest of Thunderbolt Company, Morgan ordered an immediate withdrawal to the battalion rally point. They had accomplished their mission, identifying the Iraqi defensive positions and striking a high-value target. Now it was time to let the main force finish the job. At the rally point, Bennett was waiting for them, a rare smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. Well done, Morgan. Division intelligence confirms that you hit the brigade command post. Early reports suggest that al-Rashidi himself may have been killed or wounded in the strike. Morgan received this news with mixed emotions. Al-Rashidi had been a worthy opponent, a professional soldier doing his duty just as Morgan was doing his. There was no personal animosity, only the impersonal machinery of war that had placed them on opposite sides of a conflict. "What's our next move, sir?" Morgan asked. Division is preparing a major push along the entire front. The Iraqi defenses are crumbling faster than anyone anticipated. Kuwait City could be liberated within days. The prediction proved accurate. Over the next 72 hours, coalition forces advanced rapidly against disintegrating Iraqi resistance. Thunderbolt Company, as part of the spearhead, participated in several more engagements, each less contested than the last, as Iraqi forces increasingly chose surrender over hopeless resistance. 1 week after their initial crossing into Iraq, Morgan stood atop his tank at a checkpoint outside Kuwait City, watching as long columns of Iraqi prisoners were processed by military police. Many appeared relieved rather than defeated, grateful to be out of a war they had never wanted. Martinez joined him, offering a canteen of water. "Hard to believe it's almost over, isn't it, sir?" Morgan nodded, taking a sip of the warm water. "Doesn't seem real. After all the preparation, all the training, it's ending so quickly." "That's because we did it right," Martinez replied. "Hit them hard, hit them fast, never let them recover their balance." He gestured toward the prisoners. "Most of these guys are conscripts. They didn't want this fight any more than we did." Morgan's thoughts drifted to the Iraqi commander, al-Rashidi. Reports had confirmed that he had been wounded in Thunderbolt's strike on the command post, though he had survived and was now among the thousands of Iraqi prisoners. "I'd like to meet him someday," Morgan said quietly. "When all this is over, I'd like to sit down with al-Rashidi and talk soldier to soldier." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "The man tried to kill us, sir. He was doing his job, just as we were doing ours. There's no personal hatred there, Bulldog. Just the tragedy of war that puts good men on opposite sides of a conflict." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bennett's command vehicle. The battalion commander looked exhausted but satisfied as he approached Morgan. "Captain Morgan, I've just come from division headquarters. They're issuing new deployment orders. Most of the heavy armor units will be rotating back to the States within the next month." "Including us, sir?" Bennett nodded. "Including us." But before that happens, I wanted to give you some news. Your actions during the campaign, particularly the night ambush and the strike on the Iraqi command post, have been noted at the highest levels. I've recommended you for the Silver Star, and Division has approved. Morgan was momentarily speechless. The Silver Star was one of the nation's highest decorations for valor in combat. Sir, I don't know what to say. I was just doing my job. And it wasn't just me, it was every man in Thunderbolt Company. I know that, Morgan, and they'll be recognized as well. But leadership matters. Your decisions, your initiative, made the difference between success and something less. Bennett extended his hand. Congratulations, Major Morgan. Morgan blinked in surprise. Major? Your promotion has been approved as well, effective immediately. The battalion will need a new executive officer when we return home. The position is yours if you want it. As Bennett walked away, Morgan stood in stunned silence. After years of butting heads with the likes of Harrison, of being viewed as too unconventional for the peacetime army, his approach had been validated in the crucible of combat. Major Morgan, Martinez said, testing the sound of it, has a nice ring to it, sir. Morgan smiled, though his thoughts were already turning to the responsibilities that would come with his new rank. Better not get used to it yet, Bulldog. We've still got a job to finish here. 10 years later, Colonel Robert Morgan stood before a class of cadets at the United States Military Academy at West Point. The young men and women before him would form the next generation of Army officers, leading American soldiers in whatever conflicts the future might hold. The lesson of Operation Desert Storm wasn't about technology or firepower, though both played their roles, Morgan told them, his voice carrying through the lecture hall. It was about adaptability, initiative, and the courage to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. He advanced to the next slide in his presentation, showing a thermal image of Iraqi tanks burning in the desert night. This was the view from my tank during what came to be known as the Highway 8 ambush. 14 American tanks against a column of more than 20 Iraqi vehicles. On paper, not favorable odds. But because we had positioned ourselves advantageously, because we had trained relentlessly for such engagements, and because each tank commander knew exactly what was expected of him, we prevailed without a single American casualty. A cadet raised his hand. Sir, was there ever a moment during the conflict when you doubted the outcome? Morgan considered the question carefully. There were moments of uncertainty, yes. War is chaos, and no plan survives first contact with the enemy intact. But doubt, no. I never doubted the training, the equipment, or most importantly, the men I served alongside. As the lecture concluded and the cadets filed out, Morgan noticed a familiar face waiting near the door. Cooper, now Captain Samuel Cooper, an instructor in the Academy's engineering department. Good lecture, sir, Cooper said as they walked together across the campus. Though you left out the part where you nearly got us all killed driving straight at that Iraqi command post. Morgan laughed. Some details are best left to the classified archives on some. Besides, it worked, didn't it? It did, Cooper admitted. And speaking of working, some of us have classes to teach. Will you be at the dinner tonight? Wouldn't miss it. Tell Walker and the others I'm looking forward to seeing them. As Cooper departed, Morgan paused on the steps of the academic building, looking out over the Hudson River. 10 years had passed since those fateful days in the desert. Some of his men had left the service, returning to civilian life with their experiences forever a part of them. Others, like Cooper, had continued their Army careers, passing on the lessons they had learned to a new generation. Morgan himself had risen through the ranks, his unconventional approach now viewed as an asset rather than a liability in an era of asymmetric warfare and complex military operations. The battle for which they had trained so long, tank against tank across the plains of Europe, had never materialized. Instead, they had fought in deserts, mountains, and urban environments, adapting their tactics to each new challenge. Through it all, Morgan had carried the lessons of those 10 seconds in the desert, when split-second decisions had meant the difference between life and death. Trust your training, trust your instincts, trust the men and women who serve alongside you. As he walked toward his next appointment, Morgan reflected that perhaps the greatest victory wasn't the battles they had won, but the lives they had shaped. The young soldiers who had entered that desert as untested warriors and emerged as combat veterans. The officers who had learned that leadership meant making difficult decisions and accepting their consequences. And for Robert Morgan personally, the knowledge that when his moment of truth had arrived, those 10 seconds when everything hung in the balance, he had been ready. Not because he was braver or smarter than others, but because he had prepared himself mentally and physically for exactly that moment. In the end, that was the lesson he hoped to impart to these cadets. The technology would change. The battlefields would shift. But the fundamental truths of leadership, courage, and duty would remain constant, passed from one generation of warriors to the next like a sacred trust. 10 seconds. Sometimes that was all you had. And in those 10 seconds, you discovered who you truly were.